Hello, my little fruity pebbles. Do a quick body scan from head to toe, noticing any places that feel a little tense, and move your body, if you're able to get it to feel a little more right. Get comfy, cozy, and enjoy a cup of tea with me while I tell you a story. The story of the Isahaya Bay. Originally, this video was going to be about a much more general topic and focused on the wider tradition of fishermen blockades as an organizing tactic, which I still do intend to make into its own video eventually. However, as I began diving into this unique story of the Isahaya Bay, there were just way too many people and pieces of this unwinding, decades-long puzzle that I felt it necessary to focus on it alone in order to do it justice. I first became interested in this history because of my interest in Pokemon, of course, what else? Another YouTuber by the name of Tamahiro made a video discussing her critiques and the history of Pokemon Generation 3, Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Now, if you know anything about Pokemon, you know that the baddies in each generation have an eccentric way of how they want to reimagine the world. In Generation 3's Hoenn region, we have Team Magma and Team Aqua. And Team Aqua wants to release the legendary Pokemon Kyogre to flood the planet and expand the seas, whereas Team Magma wants to release Groudon to heat up the sun, dry up lots of the oceans, and create more available land for people and Pokemon. Now, if you're thinking, Jake, what? Neither of those make any sense as goals of a criminal organization, then you would be absolutely correct. And that's because they're hyperbolic representations of a political conflict that was raging in Japan's own backyard during the development of Pokemon Generation 3. Tamahiro has a great breakdown of some of the connections between how the Hoenn region functions, the NPCs in their dialogue, and the other themes that highlight the zeitgeist of the time to be Japan focusing a lot on environmentalism. A utopian balance of nature and prosperity, as Tamahiro puts it. I can't recommend this video enough. It was so good. I'll link it in the description in case you want to take a gander, get a little Tamahiro time in. The reason I'm making this video, though, is because the one that Tamahiro did was very focused on Pokemon, and I wanted to dive more into the Isahaya Bay conflict itself. One quick note before we get into it. I'm admittedly a bit of a weeb, but not a total weeb, so likely my pronunciation of a lot of the names of Japanese towns and places and people will be entirely fucked, and I'm trying my best, but sorry in advance. With that said, let's get into it. After the destruction of World War II, Japan had numerous simultaneous difficulties arising, of course. Despite multiple atomic bombs killing off massive numbers of their people, their population was still growing and food production was not meeting demands anymore, while at the same time their economy was failing. Japan tended to rely on public works projects to stimulate the economy, putting money into construction corporations, employing local people, and trading short-term economic boons for long-term environmental destruction. With this in mind, it was only logical that the Japanese government would try to deal with its post-World War II ails by starting more public projects, specifically in the realm of food production. In order to do this, they created the Nagasaki Great Reclamation Plan in 1952, which would later be renamed nearly half a dozen times, the Nagasaki Reclamation Project in 1964, the South Nagasaki Comprehensive Development Project, aka SouthCon, in 1970, which eventually people would just colloquially talk about by the 2000s as either the Isahaya Bay Project or the Isahaya Reclamation Project. I'll likely be using many of these terms interchangeably based on the time period that I'm discussing, but they all mean the same thing. I'll also be using the words levee, gate, dike, embankment, and dam to refer to the structure that they plan to use for the project. The plan would be to take the Isahaya Bay and cut off the flow of water from the Ariake Sea with a gate of sorts, and then they would drain a lot of the water, and then poof, you'd have 10,000 hectares of farmable land for rice paddies, simultaneously stimulating the economy, increasing rice production, and pumping money into manufacturing for the levee that would block off the water. Oh my god, I filled this way too high. For hundreds of years, Japan had been reclaiming lands because a significant amount of their territory is uninhabitable mountains and other forms of difficult terrains. The biggest difference here was a mixture of the Industrial Revolution and post-World War II manufacturing growth, which kicked this pattern into absolute overdrive. Alongside this increase in environmental destruction and pollution, an environmentalist movement spawned in response. Before breaking down the different sides of the conflict, I'd like to take a moment to just explore the Isahaya Bay itself. This is Japan. Japan is broken up into 4 main islands. There's Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. Kyushu is the southernmost part of the island and is composed of 7 prefectures. The prefectures are other smaller areas like counties to a state or states to the US. These 7 prefectures in Kyushu are Fukuoka, Saga, Oita, Nagasaki, Kumamoto, Miyazaki, and Kagoshima. The Ariake Sea sits to the east of Nagasaki and to the south of both Saga and Fukuoka, wherein the Isahaya Bay lies, just outside of Isahaya, a city within the Nagasaki prefecture. So what is so special about this bay anyway? Well, dear viewer, let me tell you. There are just so many things that make this bay incredibly special. First and foremost, there was a huge amount of biodiversity in this one particular area. Nearly 300 species lived in the bay. Many migratory birds stopped on their way there from Siberia to Australasia. Large numbers of aquatic creatures and bottom dwellers such as mud skippers and a number of endangered crabs and clams, as well as about 40% of Japan's nori production existed in just this one area. The bay had between 5 and 7 meters of tidal variation at its maximum, among the absolute highest in Japan, which meant that significant amounts of water were flowing in and out of the area, allowing vast quantities of nutrients into the waters of the Ariake Sea, which were critical for nori growth and created a sort of natural purification system. One of the primary community organizers who spent his entire life, or a good chunk of it at least, defending the Isahaya Bay was an ichthyologist, read fish genius, named Hirofumi Yamashita, who described this bay as one of the richest wetland ecosystems in the world. And because of the unique nature of this bay, traditions formed around the reality of this biodiversity. For example, mutsukake was a traditional technique of fishing used to take mutsugoro, also known as mudskippers, which are an unusual fish found in Japan only in the Ariake Sea. The mudskippers existed at their highest concentrations though, specifically within the Isahaya Bay. And so they became both a delicacy and a sort of symbol of the area itself. A reporter by the name of Michael Stanley visited the Isahaya Bay in September of 1996, wherein he photographed the last season of the mutsukake. He met up with Horimichi Harada, an Ariake fisherman, who guided him. Let me end this section by reading a bit about his experience with Harada. Michael Stanley says, quote, "With him, I traveled out to the center of the tidal flats and was able to see the rich life of the bay firsthand. It was not an easy undertaking, as the gata, which is tidal mud, away from the shoreline is not firm enough to stand or walk on. Ariake fishermen move about on the gata using shaped planks up to 2 meters in length on which they kneel and propel themselves by pushing with one leg. This technique, imitating the movement of the mud skippers, is quite common in the muddy estuaries and tidal flats of tropical Asia, but in Japan is encountered only in the Ariake. I had to do the same with all the camera gear precariously loaded into a large wooden tub atop the plank. That narrow piece of lumber became my trusty vessel and work platform out on one of the most unusual corners of this planet that I have ever visited." He continues on to describe more of the scene. While the scenery was flat, wet, and generally of a consistency between freshly poured concrete and barbecue sauce, the array of life was astounding. The small creatures were hyper-skittish. The mudskippers, crabs, and other fauna would hastily dive into their burrows at our approach, although after some minutes of motionless waiting, legs and eyes and fins would begin to reappear. The mud would come to life again, and Harada would begin his fishing, casting and snagging the mudskippers through their gill covers in one smooth motion that did not alarm the creatures enough to send them headlong into their hiding holes. We had to keep an eye on the time as the 6-meter tides of the bay rise very quickly. I spent 3 days out on the farther flats with the incomplete dike always looming in the background. At this point, you may be asking, where is the conflict? I mean, there's still plenty of space in the Ariake Sea for the fishermen to fish, and with the levee severing water flow to the Isahaya Bay, farmers get more land to cultivate, and the government stimulates local economic growth and food production simultaneously. Well, unfortunately, cutting off the flow of water had disastrous impacts on the environment, resulting in the disappearance of hundreds of species of fish, amphibians, and migratory birds, and it also created a static water state that prevented the natural purification of the area, resulting in large quantities of natural water blooms. This is especially harmful because the Japanese government had been doing similar land reclamation projects for, like I said, a really long time now, slowly devouring the coastline of the Ariake Sea, making it even more necessary that the Isahaya Bay remained untouched. When the dike closed and shut off water to the Isahaya Bay, water quality declined precipitously. Healthy tides necessary for water purification were blocked. Both aquatic creatures that naturally purify the water and the ones that eat the critters that produce natural toxins were dying. Natural water blooms of algae flourished in this environment, creating red tides, discoloring the water, and further speeding up the process of pollution. To explain this a little further, the tides that would have been there without the levee would wash loads of these algal blooms out to the Ariake Sea and then disperse them. But now, because they were stuck there, they were concentrated with no way to escape in just the Isahaya Bay. So their population exploded, and when combined with the lack of tides, resulted in an oxygen-deficient, hostile environment with a sedimentation of silt on the seabed, further killing off fish and shellfish species. With the bay rapidly declining in water quality and many of the species that created a highly biodiverse aquatic environment either fleeing or dying out, fishermen were upset and angry, to say the least. And like I said earlier, it was not just the critters in the Isahaya Bay that were decreasing in number. Until 2001, the Ariake Sea produced 40% of Japan's total nori harvest, worth about 40 billion yen per year. However, in 2001, the harvest in the 4 prefectures of Nagasaki, Saga, Fukuoka, and Kumamoto surrounding the Ariake Sea dropped between 23% and 50% of the volume of the 2000 harvest. As a result, unit prices rose as much as 33%, but the quality was markedly poorer. In 2002, this trend continued with further declining quality and quantity of nori, forcing nori producers in the Ariake area to face the reality of financial ruin. Remember a few minutes ago when I talked about that one reporter, Michael Stanley, who discussed his experience of vitality and natural beauty in the Isahaya Bay in September of 1996? Well, the levee closed in April of 1997, and he returned in December of 1997, only 15 months after his initial visit, and only 8 months after the dike's closing, to a drastically changed reality. I'm going to quote him again. He said, quote, "I visited the bay again and walked out to the areas where I had photographed and watched Harada. The gata, again the tidal mud, had dried out and cracked deeply. The remains of small animals were scattered across what had once been a galaxy of life. Nothing moved. The clicking, gurgling sounds of the crabs and the cries of gulls and terns were replaced by an occasional rustle of wind, nothing more." This sounds bad, right? Like really, really bad for the environment. Well, like I said, that was only 8 months after the initial dike closed in April of 1997. And this story reached an end, kind of, to its legal battle in March of 2023. Yeah, you heard that right. Only a few months ago, Japan's Supreme Court made another ruling relating to this conflict. I believe that that's like a relatively definitive end to this saga, but I'm sure there will be new lawsuits and challenges on the horizon. But since the environmental destruction was so clear, who would be on the side of keeping those gates closed? There are a lot of people and community groups, governmental agencies, legal institutions, and flora and fauna involved in this battle. I'm gonna do my best to break it down into 3 separate groups. So we have the fishermen and their allies, the farmers and their ilk, and then the government and their associates. So first, the fishermen. I've chosen to include seaweed, mud skippers, migratory birds, bivalve pen shellfish, and the hundreds of other species impacted by the guillotining of the Isahaya Bay in with the fishermen because their overall goals align, right? AKA trying to keep this once thriving wetland from drying up and dying out. Akio Manaki is the name of the lead lawyer who is representing the class action lawsuit brought by the fishermen. He's been the lead on the fishermen team for decades through a complicated and consistent back and forth, climbing up the Japanese legal system from Nagasaki District Court to the Fukuoka High Court, all the way up to the Japanese Supreme Court. Another key player is the ichthyologist and activist that I mentioned earlier, Hirofumi Yamashita, who actually won the 1998 Goldman Prize for his efforts. He was born on February 19th, 1934, and passed away in the middle of this fight on July 21st, 2000 at 66 years old. Yamashita found out what the government was planning for the Isahaya Bay in 1972, and just a year later, he had become known as the ardent regional labor organizer who established the Association to Protect the Natural Environment of Isahaya in 1973. He received anonymous phone threats, was dragged and ridiculed in the media, and was ostracized by many of his colleagues at the Ariake Sea Fisheries Experiment Station. Yamashita was offered a 268,000 yen payment by the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery to stop his efforts to save the Isahaya Bay, but he refused. In 1992, he was able to catalyze other organizations to form the Japan Wetlands Action Network and became the spokesperson for it, representing 70 grassroots and national conservation orgs. I'm going to get a bit more into his impact later, and also about a discovery that he made, regarding some very shady governmental practices relating to their environmental impact assessment. But I think it's a good amount of background so far for him. I think it'll be a little bit easier to understand his role in the story once all of the players have been laid out. Behind him were also several organizations like the National League of Environmentalists in Tokyo and the Ramsar Center. What's the Ramsar Center, you may be asking? Ramsar sites in Japan include various types of wetlands, such as marshlands, lakes, rice paddies, seagrass, seaweed beds, tidal flats, mangrove forests, coral reefs, and groundwater systems, reflecting the incredible diversity of Japan's wetland ecosystem. There was an annual Ramsar convention starting in 1993 in the Asia region that focused on the international importance of these sites in general, but especially as waterfowl habitats. Remember that. Those water birds are important. The Ramsar Center Japan was meant to contribute to increasing the number of Ramsar sites and enhancing the nature conservation movement, specifically with participatory action from local communities. At the head of the Ramsar Center was the Ramsar Secretariat, who had the power and sway with the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery, so it was vital that environmentalists could maintain open communication with the Ramsar Secretariat to be successful in their endeavors. Next, we have the farmers. Honestly, this group has the least amount of available information about them because they were kind of shoehorned into an odd spot, right? Like, the government created the plan and then siphoned off the water flow to create this land for the farmers. They then moved into the area and cultivated the newly available soil. Once they'd been farming for nearly a decade almost, and some of the initial legal challenges by the fishermen indicated the possibility of the levee opening up, the farmers felt compelled to fight against that change. I mean, they were promised land, they bought it, produced crops for several seasons, and then they were told all of a sudden that a group of angry fishermen were going to flood their lands, destroy their livelihoods and the soil by making it exceptionally salty, salinated from the sea, not like angry soil. I guess the soil would probably be angry too, from the tides, whatever. And then they were going to get forced out of the area, basically. At that point, what can you really do except for fight back? So they got organized, created a class action lawsuit of their own, and tried their best to keep the dike closed, protecting their land and therefore their employment. Finally, we have governmental institutions and agencies. Let's start with the biggest players of all. The biggest one is the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery, which I will refer to as MAF from now on, MAFF. And then we also have the Ministry of the Environment, which I'll refer to as MO going forward. MAF and MO, you got it? Right? MAF, MO, good. And boy, were they doing some shady shit, let me tell you. We also have several courts wherein the primary legal battles took place. The Saga and Nagasaki district courts are a big deal. The Fukuoka High Court and the Supreme Court are the biggest ones for this legal battle. Now you have all the pieces. It's time to get them on the chessboard and see how they play. There's a lot of back and forth in this story, so I'm going to walk you through this in the form of a timeline with the most important protests, legal decisions, weather events, and whatever else is necessary to understand this absolute disaster of a 7-decade conflict. Like I mentioned near the start of our story, post-World War II Japan struggled with food production, so they announced the Nagasaki Great Reclamation Plan to make more farmland in 1952. In 1957, there was a massive flood that they labeled the Isahaya Big Flood, which killed 682 people, which would later be used to further justify the plan because the levee that was originally planned as part of the project is basically a form of a gate that blocks water flow, right? And it's specifically meant to help with preventing flooding. The plan seemed like a win-win then, both increasing rice production and preventing another natural disaster in an area with such natural high tides. In 1964, the plan was officially approved to increase rice production, and the whole 10,000 hectares of the Isahaya Bay was to be cut off. The following year, in 1965, 12 fishermen cooperatives within the bay organized a committee to oppose the project, and 400 fishing boats protested on the Ariake Sea. A few years later, the need for rice production declined, and so the project was quietly abandoned, and then started back up, and then modified. So that by 1970, it was mostly about increasing farmlands for other needs, including expensive cattle for Wagyu beef. This never really took off either because the market prices for Wagyu beef dropped intensely in the early 1980s. In July of 1982, there was actually another big flood called the Nagasaki Big Flood that killed 299 people, furthering the public need for some sort of safety measure against these mighty waters. The Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery, MAF, then announced that because they couldn't get approval for the project for cattle raising specifically, and they had already gotten it for rice, but rice production was no longer as needed, that they would redirect to promote the reclamation project's primary goal as flood control. In 1983, MAF established a committee to consider this proposal, and that committee went on to suggest that MAF reduce the amount of space taken from the bay from 10,000 hectares to 3,900 hectares. A fishermen's coalition insisted that the plan be less than 3,000 hectares of the bay, and it was cut down to 3,500 in a compromise in 1985. In 1986, the Kyushu Agricultural Policy Bureau submitted a draft environmental impact assessment in September, while the Fishermen's Cooperative signed a compensation agreement for 24.35 billion yen, and then another one for an additional 1.2 billion yen, bringing the total cost projected to be 135 billion yen with a projected finish year of 2000. In early 1989, several national and international conservation groups came out with a document entitled A Status Overview of Asian Wetlands, in which they described the pressure on wetlands is severe from rapid development in the recent past, particularly from canalization of river channels and conversion of coastal marshes and mudflats to agricultural land and industrial development. Within that document, they named the dike severing the water flow in the Isahaya Bay project as both a project and a threat. Then, quickly afterwards, they list 9 species of birds and shellfish and other creatures that are important to protect given what this project is likely going to do. Later that same year, in November of 1989, the project began, and within 3 years of constructing the tidal dam, not closing it, just beginning the construction, bivalve shellfish began dying off in huge numbers, so much so that by June of 1993, bivalve fisheries ceased in the Isahaya Bay entirely. Obviously, this alarmed the fishermen, so the Kyushu Agricultural Policy Bureau created a committee to look into the cause of the mass die-offs. Okay, so this next part is a little bit complicated because it seems like there are multiple sources for this, but it is not 100% clear what this document is. So take this next part with a grain of salt because I wasn't fully able to confirm this with the sources that I feel particularly comfortable with. But apparently, around this time in the early to mid 1990s, Hirofumi Yamashita, the activist that I talked about earlier, uncovered some kind of a report that had been suppressed by the government for 13 years. The document allegedly proved that they knew that the levee would not be effective as a flood prevention measure, and that little demand even existed at the time for new farmland. This would mean that around the time of the Second Great Flood, that the government knew this project wouldn't help, but went forward with it anyway. Possibly for PR, to say that they were doing something about this disaster, and maybe also because they just didn't know what else to do or how else to prevent something like that from happening. It's really not particularly clear. Yamashita continued on with his own research as an ichthyologist, of course, providing evidence of the rich biodiversity of the bay's bottom-dwelling organisms, further revealing the deficiencies in the government's environmental impact assessment to date. So yeah, the government had already been doing some shady shit for over a decade, it seems, by burying this report for 13 years. But it was about to get a whole lot worse, because that was just about hiding information. This next part seems like they might have been actively lying. Around this time in 1993 to 1994-ish, the Ministry of the Environment, Mo, you remember Mo, we talked about Mo, started saying that they had completed some sort of monitoring project before even starting the Isahaya Bay project, and determined that no waterbird species would become extinct due to the gate. This contradicted an official statement by the government confirming that no comprehensive investigations on migratory bird species were carried out covering all tidal mudflats within the Isahaya Bay. So, in response, the National League of Environmentalists in Tokyo submitted a letter to the Ramsar Secretariat requesting that they recommend the suspension of the Isahaya Reclamation Project. So the Ramsar Secretariat asked Mo about it. In 1997, Mo responded stating that the birds in the area have other nearby tidal flats that they regularly move to and where there are plenty of their main food sources, so this will not extinct any migratory birds. They also mentioned that they really needed the space for agricultural high productivity of the area and to prevent disasters like floods. Mo's letter also stated that they were taking 3 primary environmental measures. First, environmental monitoring. Second, facilitating restoration of tidal mudflats. And 3, wild bird monitoring. Okay, I'm trying to stay in order because there's like a lot of back and forth and different pieces about this, but before we get to the next big point, I need to take you back to before Mo started talking about this special environmental impact assessment that they had apparently completed to ensure that waterfowl would just be like totally fine. In 1993, the Japanese government and several NGOs reported that the remaining mudflat areas in Japan were disappearing mainly due to development plans in coastal areas, specifically saying that 4 major tidal mudflat areas in Japan are endangered. Guess which was one of those 4? Yeah, you guessed it, it's the Isahaya Bay. Mo, in response to this, started saying that, well, we did our own report, and that this project was inevitable for flood control in more agricultural lands. So conservation NGOs were like, is this the best way to create flood control? Do we actually need more reclaimed lands for agricultural purposes today? We're losing the largest and most valuable mudflat area in Japan because mega development schemes are just, unstoppable? Mo failed to respond to these 3 important questions. I, however, have the benefit of years of hindsight and lots of research to help you answer them. So to the question of whether the 7-kilometer embankment was the best way to prevent future floods, experts generally believed that the last floods in 1957 and in 1982 were the kind that only come once or twice every 100 years or so. So they kind of concluded that it would not make sense to destroy the bay for some unknown future event that may or may not occur. I mean, I think that there is a lot of value to creating safety precautions because of climate change and things are going to be getting worse, but it's hard to say that that is something that they knew or were trying to put forward in that moment. To the second question of whether or not Japan needed more reclaimed lands for agricultural purposes, today, well, the answer is essentially no as well. The original idea was to provide new fields for farmers in the area, but the number of farmers, which had already begun to drop in the 1960s, fell rapidly thereafter and was reduced to almost half between 1985 and 1995. The prospect that nobody would actually farm these fields posed a huge problem to MAF because the Isahaya project, at 237 billion yen, was a massive civil engineering program and a significant chunk of their construction budget, which then responds to the final question. Is it basically just too late to stop it despite the harm it is already causing and will continue to cause? To that, a higher up at MAF, Fujinami Takao, in an interview stated that the current ecosystem may disappear, but nature will create a new one. Pretty sure that's not how that works, bud. I don't really know where you're getting that, but no. No, it won't. Baffling. Step 1 of the project, the tidal dam, was completed on April 14th, 1997, and they held a ceremony to shut the 293 iron gates to complete the seawall. The ceremony was televised, skyrocketing what was a somewhat known local project into a major national issue, capturing the attention of many Japanese citizens. Within months, farmers moved into the community to claim the 1,500 hectares of readily available farmland, and their livelihoods became tied to keeping the water out of the bay. MAF modified the project further in 1999, and the total cost soared to 249 billion yen, with a new projected completion date in 2006. So the government was all in at this point, tied to the completion of this project with a $250 billion invested. In 2000, 25 fishermen held a protest in front of the Northern Iron Gate backed by 70 boats requesting that it be opened, led by none other than Hirofumi Yamashita, who actually ended up passing away from heart failure in his home in Isahaya only a few months later at 66 years old. His death would turn out to be a pretty bad omen of further loss to come. Shortly after his death, there was a huge red tide that damaged local seaweed production, and nori became pale and continued to decrease in quality. After Hirofumi's death, his wife Yatiyo Yamashita continued the movement. Many fishermen stood by her, of course, and fought harder in Hirofumi's honor for the bay that he had loved so dearly and had worked so hard to try to protect. However, around this time and in the years since, conflict began and eventually grew quite large within the fishermen group. Many of them were unable to maintain their livelihoods as the fish died off and the seaweed wilted, so they were forced to abandon their work and take jobs with the construction company. Yeah, the same construction company that was building the gate that would further kill off the only life and career they had once known. This didn't seem to impact the fishermen's organizing efforts in the early 2000s that much, because the pattern was just kind of beginning. For one local fishermen's union, though, half of the members had already switched sides. Yaito responded, saying, "Though I'm sympathetic to the fishermen, it is a great blow to our work." Okay, this next part gets a little rough. I feel it necessary to add this next part to highlight the severity of the situation that the fishermen were in, and I don't want to say any of this lightly, and I'm not trying to use this as some form of like drama alert, but merely to show how impactful the decline of the bay was on the lives of those surrounding it. So content warning, I will be talking about suicide and homicide, so skip to this time code if that's something that you don't want to hear about. Yaito's sympathy was absolutely necessary, as several fishermen were in such insupportable debt, knowing that the bay was dying in front of them, often feeling hopeless in their battle against the government, and a string of suicides took place. They took their own lives, seeing no other way to recover from this emerging disaster. In one particularly horrible case, a lobber seaweed aquaculturalist attempted double suicide with his elderly mother, killing her first and then failed to kill himself, so he was indicted for her murder. Again, I want to be clear, the only reason I'm sharing this is to help paint the picture of just how serious the destruction of this local environment was. Not only were people's livelihoods on the line, but their very lives were too. In January of 2001, however, the movement was actually still going strong. The fishermen began a series of increasingly large protests. At first, there was just 1,000 fishermen, which is already a fucking ton, from Nagasaki, Saga, Fukuoka, and Kumamoto, who protested on 400 boats, followed by a protest shortly thereafter with 1,200 fishermen on 300 boats, and then a third with 6,000 fishermen on 1,300 boats, all within the same month, January of 2001. Like, these fishermen were pissed, and they were ready to fucking fight! They were ready to fight for their livelihoods and for the Isahaya Bay. MAF, with the backdrop of these increasingly large protests and fish depletion, had to respond, so they created 2 committees to investigate what was going on with both nori production and then further looking specifically just into the environmental impact of the dike. The committee reviewing National Project's environmental impact suggested a rearrangement of the project, cutting the overall reclaimed land area in half again. Like, at this point, guys, just give up. Like, you have to keep making it smaller and smaller, because obviously this is absolutely terrible for the environment, and at this point not necessary for food production. And apparently you also had a government document that showed 13 years ago you already knew it wasn't going to be helpful for flood control either, which is the main point of the project at this point. So like, what are you doing? The Nori Committee proposed investigations by opening some sections of the gate for 3 different time periods to see the impacts that it could have on nori and the overall health of the bay. The time periods were a short-term investigation for 2 months, a medium-term investigation for about 6 months, and then a long-term one opening parts of the gate for several years. In April of 2002, the short-term investigation began, and they released the results of the report in November of 2003, saying that the gate mostly just impacted the very inner Isahaya Bay, but only like a little bit, and so there's no need really to continue on with the investigations in the medium and long term. Really? The fishermen were like, absolutely not. So they battled harder with more protests, demanding that they carry on with the medium and long-term investigations, to which MAF just outright said, no, we won't do that. We won't do the longer investigations, and they said that in May of 2004. Between the time that the short-term investigation began and that the report came out, so between April of 2002 and November of 2003, the Japanese government of the Kumamoto Prefecture brought into law a plan for the restoration of the Ariake Sea in November of 2002. They aimed to measure the restoration by demonstrable changes in water quality, which would come about through efforts to change how the local community interacts with the sea, reducing waste dumping, cleaning up debris, etc., and attempting also to rebuild the natural river purification function through coastal maintenance. They also included sections about breeding and aquaculture to restore some of the natural biodiversity that existed there, which would be difficult without the prior changes in place, as anything that they tried to grow or maintain would likely die in such a eutrophic environment. So this plan sounds great and all, but how were they going to put this into action when the gate was still closed? Meanwhile, the Saga Prefecture local court decided that the Isahaya Bay reclamation project needed to be suspended because of the relationship between its rise and the subsequent damage to local fisheries. The Nagasaki local court, however, said that they couldn't recognize the appropriateness of local wildlife as the accusers for a case. The Fukuoka High Court, one step above both the Saga and the Nagasaki local courts in the hierarchy of the court system, had said in May of 2005 that basically there was no way that we can deny the relationship between this project and the damage done to the local fisheries, because like it was obvious, but that there wasn't enough evidence for some reason, correlation not equaling causation, I guess. After doing all of this research on my end around everything that was going on at the time, I'm genuinely very unclear on what kind of information they would possibly need to prove the impact that this was having in order to open the gates again. And so they canceled Saga's canceling of the project, and once again it was back on. 2 months later, in July of 2005, over 1,000 people joined the lawsuit to restore the Ariake Sea, increasing the total number of plaintiffs to 2,000. Naturally, the fishermen continued their legal battle, helmed by Akio Manaki. In December of 2010, the Fukuoka High Court ruled in favor of the fishermen. This was probably the biggest moment in the legal battle. Up to this point, this was definitely the biggest moment in the legal battle, granting indirect compulsory compensation, saying that the gates were to be opened within 3 years. The gates were to stay open for 5 years, and research was to be done to determine the relationship between the project and the damage done to the fisheries. The state appealed to the Supreme Court, and the appeal was rejected in January of 2015, which meant that now they were required to pay 450,000 yen daily to the fishermen until they opened the gates, and this amount was then doubled to 900,000 yen after the fishermen applied for more, and that was also granted by the Fukuoka High Court. This actually then went back because the government challenged the increase, which was upheld at first, but then overturned in 2018 and brought back down to 450,000 yen. Still, huge deal. The fishermen are going to get paid, even if their area is dying. Shortly after the Fukuoka High Court ruled in favor of the fishermen in 2010, the farmers were now getting concerned, right, about the gates possibly opening, so they sought an injunction to prevent the gates from doing just that. In November of 2013, shortly before the deadline to open the gates, the Nagasaki District Court gave a provisional disposition ordering that the gates remain closed or compensate the farmers at 490,000 yen per day. The state appealed, but the Supreme Court dismissed this appeal in January of 2015. So class, if you were following along, which I can't imagine would be particularly easy to do because this is an extremely complicated situation, then you would know that the state was now in a ridiculous lose-lose situation because the Supreme Court had just ruled in favor of both the fishermen and the farmers in 2 separate class action lawsuits. If they open the gates, they destroy the farmers' livelihood and they owe them 490,000 yen daily. If they keep the gates closed, they further kill the Isahaya Bay and owe the fishermen 450,000 yen daily. They're stuck. And at this point, I really have to ask, what the fuck was going on with the Japanese Supreme Court that this didn't come to their attention in some way, that they had just done this, and I think it's in the same month. Yeah, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal from the state in January of 2015 from both the fishermen and the farmers. This just cannot end well for anyone. In April of 2017, the Nagasaki District Court ruled in favor of the farmers yet again, preventing the gates from opening and hoping to settle with the fishermen by establishing a fund for them. The Supreme Court, recognizing the bind that they had just enabled, recommended a three-party settlement among the fishermen, the farmers, and the state. But a settlement was not reached during these discussions in 2018. Because they were unable to come to an agreement at the suggestion of the Supreme Court, the state was freed from its obligation to make indirect compulsory payments for not opening the gates, essentially screwing the fishermen. In 2019, the Supreme Court then sent the case back to the Fukuoka High Court, and on March 25th, 2022, they further agreed that it had been too long since the 2010 initial ruling in favor of the fishermen, and that the damage to the fishing operations had diminished. Plus, the government had already paid out over 1.2 billion yen to the fishermen, and that was essentially good enough. They began describing the impact as diminished because the fishermen's catches in the Ariake Sea had began increasing, notice my very vigorous air quotes, around 2013. They had two other important justifications for their decision. First, the government had already put in 250 billion yen into the project, which is like literally what they said. They were like, we've invested too much at this point. And with climate change being a major problem, the public value for flood prevention had actually increased since the original closing of the bay in 1997. Akio Manaki, as I've mentioned him multiple times before, the lead lawyer for the fishermen, appealed the ruling and it went back to the Supreme Court again. He stated, all the reasoning laid out in the ruling was based on wrong interpretation of the facts, merely cherry-picking data to wrongly claim that the catches were increasing. There is no way that the Supreme Court can stand by such a ruling. Testimonials from fishermen in the area highlight just how absolutely incorrect the court's interpretation of the facts were. Nobukiyo Hirokata, a 69-year-old who used to harvest bivalve pen shellfish in the bay, described his own experience that reinforced a study from the fall of 2021, which showed that none of the shellfish had matured to a suitable size for harvesting, resulting in the 10th straight year fishing had to be canceled. He said, if the catch was actually increasing, we would not be putting up a legal fight. Does this mean that the people who feel wronged have no choice but to succumb to the pressure of the central government? He continued on to describe how he used to dive into the bay to harvest, but now the seabed is pitch black. There is no way marine life can exist in such an environment. Farmers, however, like 45-year-old Kazuyuki Araki, rejoiced at the decision. He knew that opening the gates would raise salinity levels, rendering their land useless to grow the cabbage and other vegetables he had cultivated for over a decade, so he was grateful to be able to continue tilling the soil and raising the crops. Finally, in March of 2023, just 6 months ago, a little over 70 years after the original idea began to develop for the Nagasaki Great Reclamation Plan, the Supreme Court returned to this case and finalized their ruling to keep the Isahaya Bay gates closed for good. So, why did I tell you this story and what can it teach us? Well, for one, it's an incredibly fascinating tale about a 71-year-old debacle between multiple groups vying for their livelihoods with, to me, what seems to be one clear group in the right, but lots of complications associated with that. And this story has got it all. It's got the failures of the legislature and the judicial systems, the uniquely shitty position that the farmers and the fishermen who switched sides found themselves in, and the downright unjust ways that their fishermen were treated, resulting in the death and decay of one of the most beautifully biodiverse wetlands in the world. Despite protests increasing in size, legal battles raging on, the need for the project to exist kind of just disappearing, and the government bleeding money left and right, the people who created this plan in the first place seemed to just rely on stubbornness and spite to finish the levy, being unwilling to admit they were wrong, cut their losses, and scrap this extremely harmful project. Instead, they hid, diminished, and lied about documentation that proved the damage they were doing to the local environment. Japan has a long history of creating public works projects at the expense of nature, as I mentioned at the very start. And clearly, this is not unique to Japan. I'm not trying to cancel the entirety of Japan. Maybe the concept of governments, which we can get into at another time, but that's another story. All countries do this, but what is unique to Japan is their cultural ideas about natural heritage and connection to nature. The way much of the world connects to, interacts with, and learns about Japan's culture for the first time is through its exported products, namely media and food. both of which are integrally tied to a symbiotic relationship between nature and community, as described by Tamahiro further in her video about Pokemon Gen 3 that I mentioned at the start. I mean, I remember growing up, and as a kid, watching Pokemon, dreaming about existing in this world that limits industrialization and values the beauty of nature and community, and protects creatures above and below the seas with a ferocity only matched by the depths of their friendships and the strengths of their battles. Yet, the reality of Japan's integration with nature is much more grim. Nature is not open and free. It's neatly packaged and controlled. Instead of being a beacon for environmentalism, the Japanese government relies on short-sighted projects for solutions to long-term problems that both exacerbate climate change and out-of-control environmental destruction. Again, this is not unique to Japan, but I guess for me, someone who grew up loving nature and getting involved in climate activism for a while, and much of that interest stemming from the Japanese media that I consumed, the story just felt especially pernicious. As governments continue to trade natural resources for financial gain, we are going to have to be the ones to hold them accountable and push back. So look to your community, much like Hirofumi Yamashita did, and the fishermen who fought alongside him for decades to try to protect their beloved Isahaya Bay. They might not have succeeded in the way that they had hoped for, but it is definitely not too late for you to get involved and make a difference. I'll leave a few ways for you to get involved in the US in general and in Chicago specifically, as well as a resource packet that helped me think about climate activism in kind of a helpful and new way. Thank you so much for watching. I know that this was a little bit of a long video, so I really appreciate you sticking it out if you did, and getting whatever you got out of it. I'd love to hear kind of about that from you. Don't forget to pike at sunrise, like and subscribe. It's something like that, right? I have no idea what I'm doing. Also, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments on, did you know that this was what was going on as the background for Team Aqua and Team Magma? What do you think should have been done in this whole situation? Because there are so many complicated different parts of the story, and the sides that everybody's on get so convoluted over time. Sound off in the comments what a tangible way that you want to get involved to help address environmental destruction could be. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're showing yourself and others how much love, gratitude, and kindness you have to offer the world. I will see you soon. Bye. Third eye weeping all weekend. It's so bad. It gets so bad. It gets so bad.